All the way from Vancouver, Canada, we have Keith Ippel on today's show, co-founder and CEO of Spring Activator.
Learn Keith's philosophy of using psychology in sales, how SDRs can overcome imposter syndrome, and how you can crush quota by focusing on ICPs. Your success is our success, so let's get started.
From the heart of Silicon Valley in beautiful San Francisco, California, welcome to the SDR Live podcast with Marcos and Andy.
Awesome. Well, glad to be back on another episode of the SDR Live. Today we have Keith Ippel. Keith, welcome to the show.
Hey, Marcos. Thanks for having me. And really appreciate you guys taking the time. Great to see you again, Andy. Cool.
Yeah, and today's all about learning psychology in sales, and on top of that, looking at things like imposter syndrome. And really, the conversation is an open forum. And Keith is maybe Keith, if you could introduce yourself to the audience for those that don't know you, and share some of the credentials that you have.
Yeah, it'd be great. So thanks again for having me. My name is Keith, and I'm the co-founder and CEO of Spring. And Spring is an incubator and accelerator and ecosystem support organization. We do work in about 40 cities around the world. And we love to work at the center of impact and tech. Love to make the world a better place. Spring is my fourth venture. So I've been around the startup world now for 20 years. And, I've helped to launch businesses, sold a business, spun one out. Have been in organizations that had a lot of IP, have a couple of times taken companies from zero to, $1 million, 0 to 2 million in annual revenue, like those kind of formative early days. And finding product market fit, right, has been a big part of it. Advise a lot of companies too on everything from idea generation to exit. And it's been an incredible journey over the last bunch of years. So it's been a ton of fun. Yeah, so that's a bit about me. I'm based in Vancouver, Canada, which I will shamelessly say is one of the most beautiful places in the world. So there you go.
I still need to make my way down there. I always keep hearing about the beautiful scenery there. So
awesome. For sure.
Yeah, but thanks for joining us. And I mean, your background and expertise is, bar none, one of the best ones out there, especially, running your own company, but even advising organizations. And so something that I guess I'll start off just, as far as a question, primarily our audience is SDRs, right? That are, in this time of COVID, a lot of them, if we could think like a picture, right? Probably at home, they're not there with their team, and they might struggle with like confidence and potentially their product, but just getting rejected day in and day out. And so I'm just curious, like from your standpoint on, any advice that you would give them, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah. So it's such an important topic because, I've always viewed sales as, a mojo profession, right? Like, when you're on, and when you're not, you're not. And that's sometimes the way it feels. And I mean, the two of you know this, right? Sometimes you feel like you're on for weeks, and other times it's like, it feels almost like by the hour, you're like, I'm on, I'm not, I'm on, And rejection is a part of the game, right? It's a part of the process. And so I think for me, what I would say is most people are not wired to do sales. Everyone is wired to problem solve, right? And so it's interesting, right? Like when I give talks, I'll often, like whether the room is 30 people or 1,300 people, I'll be like, hey, show of hands, how many people want to make the world a better place? People, pretty much everybody raised their hand, and then I'm like, show of hands, how many people helped somebody else in the past week? Everybody raises their hand. And so for me, fundamentally, that is sales. Sales is problem solving, and sales is helping others. And so I find that at the end of the day, what we want to do is we want to throw the word sales out. What we want to replace it with is solutions and revenue, right? Because revenue allows us to help more and more people over time with the products and services that we offer. And so what that does is it actually does two things at the same time. One is it actually empowers us to do more revenue because we become passionate about helping others. And then the second piece is that it really empowers us to actually seek the know ourselves. And so like I often refer to SAP, which obviously is one of the largest software companies in the world. You know, they have a training program for their salespeople where literally they're going through anywhere from 7 to 13 stages where they're just looking for no before they even try and get to a yes. And the reason is because they're trying to help companies. You know, sometimes companies call SAP and they're too small. They're not big enough to absorb SAP software. Sometimes they're looking for a completely different kind of solution, right? Sometimes they don't have the budget, whatever the case may be. And so what I always find is I have excelled in sales when I always pick up the phone and I'm, you know, and I get, you know, Bob or Betty, whoever on the phone. I'm like, hey, how's it going? How can I help you today? Like sometimes when especially if I'm not feeling the mojo, I'll be like, how can I help? And then the person's like, well, thanks for asking, because like, you know, and then we start to talk about what actually their problems are. And, you know, if we take that approach, you know, it's human nature to want to solve problems. It's human nature to want to help other people. If you take that approach and those two questions are front and center every time you pick up the phone or meet someone, then revenue will always climb, right? Always. And the reason is because you start to find the people who actually have the same problems to solve. And then you find the same people who value what you offer to solve that problem, right? And honestly, I'll say something which is, you know, we always have a joke in Canada. We don't say, hi, my name is Keith. We say, sorry, my name is Keith. Okay. And so sometimes it's actually good to have a bit of a Canadian mindset, which is like, hey, sorry, I don't want to sell you today. What I actually want to do is help. Can I just help? Right? And I find that it really backs the pressure off of me. It backs the pressure off the prospect, you know, and then what we can do is just talk about the problems they need to solve. And I find that if I do 10 calls and 9 of those 10 calls, I either say no myself or they say no, or I refer them to someone else because they're clearly looking for something different. That's a good day, right? Because the 10th one is always a sale, right?
So interesting.
Yeah.
So I picked up a lot there, and I always like to write notes as I go along. And you know, 3 things really stood out. It's reframing sales from problem solving, right, and that leads to revenue. But I would think there you would have to have some type of curiosity, right? Because I feel like a lot of potentially SDRs out there, they get into the job and they're actually not excited about like the industry they play in, and so like the curiosity, you know, doesn't, you know, go forward, and that can lead to, I would think, you know, like a bad kind of like work balance.
Yeah, and you know what's interesting, right, is to your point, if I'm picking up the phone and I'm like, okay, I'm getting Marcos on the phone and I'm going to try and sell him what I've got, I have no curiosity.
Sell him, yeah, right away. Yeah, it's
and
like
so the reality though is if I go in and I'm like, who is Marcos and how can I help him today? I'm automatically curious, right? It's kind of like, honestly, it's like walking down the sidewalk, and if you see someone crying, most people don't walk by and think nothing. We're like, I wonder why they're crying. I wonder what the problem is. I wonder what happened. Like the inquisitiveness is instantaneous, right? And so I think that's, you know, the brain is comprised of 2 compartments, right? So there's one part which is like instinct, which is the stuff that is just so routine that we do it without even thinking. And then there's the second part of the brain where we actually have to think about what we're doing first. It's kind of like learning a new language, right? If you were born in a family speaking 2 languages, it's you're using the first part of your brain. But if you're trying to learn as an adult, it's definitely the second part of your brain where you're like, right, I have to translate that into. And so, but it's the same thing. If you're selling, you're trying to train yourself to be inquisitive. If you're asking how to help, that's the first part of your brain. It's instinct. You're like, hey, so how's it going? Like, what are some of the challenges you're facing? And the benefit for all of us today is like, how are you doing in this recession, right? You know, and then we get into those fun conversations of saving time, saving money, saving costs, growing revenue, all those things that all of our collective products and services often help to do, right?
Yeah.
So cool.
So I kind of had a question there, and like Andy, feel free to chime in if you had anything else. But when you're talking about this brain, right? I'm almost wondering if that's related to the imposter syndrome, or the imposter syndrome, right? Where like you have the instincts, and sometimes like I wouldn't think that's the part of the brain, but probably the other part where the thinking, the analytical, where maybe you think too much and then you get in your own head.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so imposter syndrome, for those who haven't heard it before, imposter syndrome is where you believe that you don't deserve to be where you are, right? Either in the role that you're in or in the company that you're with, or even in the stage of life, right? Like you're just like, I don't deserve this. I don't deserve to be here. And so it clearly that affects things like mojo and rhythm and confidence. And it's very common. It's actually like in the world of entrepreneurs, first thing we talk about, startup founders, is imposter syndrome. The fact that I have a company and there's like two of us working in a garage, and then I'm going up against IBM, and like, I don't even deserve to be here, right? That is a great example of imposter syndrome. And to your point, imposter syndrome comes into play, especially during the recession, when we're like, people don't really need this, right? And then we start to second guess why we're doing it. And then the imposter syndrome is not only about our sales efforts, but it's also about our own product and service, right? Because we're like, they don't really need it. They got bigger problems to solve. But that comes from a place of, to your point, of overthinking it, because we do not know what our customers are dealing with. We don't know what they're facing. We don't know what their challenges are. And so what we need to do is we need to talk to them and find out what it is, because it's amazing how sometimes the one thing that we have to offer is actually the one thing that they need right now. So I think that's the key is to imposter syndrome is always defeated in conversation. When you talk to people with this kind of problem solving mindset, and then you get to a place where you're like, actually, they do need my product and service. Or good news, they don't. I can refer them to somebody else and I can focus on those who do. So, but imposter syndrome, if you think about things like sales quotas, sales quotas in part are a technique designed to help solve imposter syndrome, because when you're kind of just focused on hitting the goal, to your point, you're not overthinking. You're just like, hey, I got to hit a number. But then the benefit is it's like, it stops you from being, halfway through the day, you're like, so why am I doing this? So you're like, no, need to hit a quota, so I'm going to keep going, right? So it's one of those things, you never think about it that way, but that's actually, it helps with imposter syndrome. It helps you to not overthink things. It helps you to just really hone in on like problem solving and then be successful. So, yeah.
I love that. And for me, like as an SDR who has been in the field for one and a half years now, I still get some spurts and bouts of imposter syndrome, especially during an economic recession. You hear different kind of voices of opinions of, oh, you shouldn't be selling right now. You should be more empathetic, etc. So that definitely affects kind of my day-to-day. And like you said, my mojo. My question to you is, are there like specific strategies or tips for maybe people like in my situation, as well as people who are just starting out, who just landed a job during this economic recession, and they feel like they know that they have value to add, but it's hard for them to kind of connect the dots that, hey, this is a high value decision maker, like the VP of sales that I'm speaking to, that I deserve their time.
So I'm going to answer that question with a story. So this is my third recession as a leader of a business. And so when the lockdown started in Canada, which essentially was the exact same time as the US, within a day, I think, like literally the next morning, I was up at 5:15 a.m., like automatically. The alarm didn't even go off. Jeez. Like it becomes instinct in these times. And so first, what I knew was like, if I don't sell, then I'm putting my future and my destiny in someone else's hands. And I never want to do that, right? So for me, like I'm getting up at 5:15 because I want to control my own future, right? So point number one. And then the second thing is, true story, for 3 weeks straight, all I did was I was on the phone nonstop every single day, or Zoom, as we all were, like our laptops were melting, right? And so, but what I did is I would pick up the phone and I had a plan. Basically what I was doing is I would try and like about 20-25% of my day was existing customers and partners, and then the remainder was new. And what I would do is I would start with the existing people who knew me or my company or my product. And I would just pick up the phone and say, hey, how you doing? Like, how's it going? Right? And that same question applies right now. We're in the midst of a recession. We still have COVID kicking around. That's still the intro question. It's like, how you doing? Like, here's the space that I'm in. This, and therefore that's how we're kind of connecting in general. But like, hey, listen, like I've been talking to a lot of people and I'm hearing like different challenges and opportunities. Like, how are you doing? And then people are like, listen, I don't have time because X. And you're like, I was actually just talking to somebody about that, and this is what they were experiencing. So what I was doing is I was first helping to remind the person they're not alone, that there's another community of people around them who are facing the same challenges. And then the second thing is I would just let them talk. People, and by the way, quick tip, don't mention COVID. COVID is the most overused word. If you mention it, it's the fastest way to get somebody off the phone. People are sick and tired of talking about it. What people want to do now is they want to talk about things like growing revenue, creating new markets, reducing costs. Don't use terms like COVID and recession, but you're just like, hey, how's it going? And so to give you context, from the moment of my first call, 4 weeks and a day later, I had sold $300,000 in services.
What?
From like none of that was on the funnel. The funnel was zero. I went from 0 to 300K in 4 weeks.
Wow.
And all I was doing was I was picking up the phone saying, how you doing? How you doing? How you doing? And listening. Because what happened is the first 2 weeks, I offered nothing to no one. All I was is like, how can I help? How are your problems? And then at the start of week 3, then I would start calling people back and be like, hey, listen, like I've talked to all these people and they said the same thing as you about this. And I think a solution for that is this. And then they'd be like, yeah, good point. And they're like, can you help? And I'd be like, as a matter of fact, I can. Now, I'll tell you, half the time I was like, I think there's a solution. And by the way, there's this guy I know, Andy, he's got that solution over at this other company. I'll introduce you. Because then if you do that, they'll become a customer in the future no matter what, right? Because now what you've done is you built trust and you built integrity and relationship, right? But for me, like, especially in this time, and I do think it's important, my perspective is the first 2 weeks of every month, I would just be calling people saying, how you doing? What are the challenges? How can I help? What can I do? But ask, don't offer anything. First 2 weeks, ask. Second 2 weeks, go back and offer to the same people. Because then what you're doing is you're saying, I'm like, hey, Andy, listen, I was talking to this guy, Marcos, and we were talking about the exact same thing, and this and this and this. And he's like, yeah, like da 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 da. And the reason, of course, is because month to month, the situation's changing, right? Like what you guys offered in May is not what you can offer in September. No way, right? Like, and so the important part is to get people talking. And so, yeah, so we did more revenue in June than we did in calendar Q2 of last year.
Nice.
And that was 2 months after the lockdown started, right? So, but the important part is like, I know nothing. We all as SDRs, we know nothing. We know nothing about what the customer is facing. We have no idea what the problems are. So we can't sell. What we do is we go in and we ask questions. And then the benefit then is we know in the last 2 weeks of a month or the last 2 weeks of a quarter, then we know who all the prospects are. We can align against all of the patterns of like how they describe the problem, how they describe the sense of urgency. Is this like a sales growth thing? Is it a reduced cost thing? Is it I have no budget thing? Like we can kind of line up all the patterns. And then what we can do is we can go back to them and say, and this is how I can help, right? And then the benefit as well is then you start knocking people down where you're like, I've started working with 13 other organizations in your industry in the past month because of this. And then they're like, really? And you're like, yeah, mention name, mention name, mention name, mention 3 names. And they're like, yeah, good, I'm good. I had a call yesterday from a government entity, and the guy called out of the blue, never spoken to him before, inbound. And he's like, listen, he said, a month ago, I saw, an announcement from this other government entity, and I know they are the leading edge people. So I noted every time they do something, I note it. But then what happened is yesterday, this other government entity who I've known, like he's like, they're part of the furniture. They've been around forever. And so he said, so a month ago, you got the industry leader, and then yesterday you sold it to the most conservative org. Now I know I have to call you, right? So that's the other trick, by the way, in all of this is always try and go sector specific and geography specific, because people are super village based right now, right? So if you're talking, for example, to a healthcare company, you're immediately talking about all the healthcare calls you've had. The other one is geography. Like if you're selling to somebody in Seattle, don't tell him you talk to somebody in Miami. He doesn't care. Yeah. Right? Talk about SeaTac, talk about Portland. Don't go any farther, because people are like, I'm in my bubble, right? And so leverage industry and leverage geography as a way to speak into the person's village, into their community, right? And the benefit for us then is, whether our territory is a state or our territory is the world, we can still cut it down into the space that makes people feel comfortable in these uncertain times, right?
That's a good point. That's something that I think I was just telling Andy the other day. I'm a huge fan of like Crunchbase or any type of information out there where it talks about where the money's going or which geographies are growing specifically in sectors. And so, the fastest growing sectors right now are like biopharma. It makes sense, right? Biopharma, and then it goes to healthcare, but virtual healthcare. And then it's like cybersecurity, right? So in that case, I'm sure you could hone in on those verticals, but to even get more granular, like industry peers that they're part of. I had a question though, when you're giving specific advice of kind of just asking a question like, how's it going? How are we doing? Is there like some type of psychology play there? Because I know a lot of SDRs, they have to make certain cold call metrics and they'll go right into their pitch, right? I haven't done this, but I haven't specifically called someone and said, hey, how's it going? Or, how are you today? How can I help? But I'm wondering if there's like some type of psychology theory there where it kind of lessens their guard so they're more open to speak.
It's a good question. Anytime you call somebody, first, you need to prove to them that you're nice, right? Like,
okay.
I work with a lot with startups. Yep. And in working with startups, there's a rule that when you're pitching investors, and studies have been done on this. So the study is that the average investor will make an investment decision on a startup within 15 minutes of the first meeting.
Wow.
So when you think like the average angel investor is, say, cutting $100,000 check into a super high risk, high chance of failure startup, 15 minutes, right? So the first thing you want to do is convey, I'm likable, I'm smart, right? And I somebody that you can build a relationship with. And so the first thing that you always want to do, and you guys know this, right, is you want to show that there's some connection between me and the person. Went to the same school, came from the same town, similar likes and interests. And so sometimes we have that data, sometimes we don't. And so, but one thing that we all have in common right now is the recession, right? And so the benefit that we have is like, hey, like crazy times, right? And so, for example, when I was talking to that cold call person the other day, I'm like, hey, so where you at? He told me where he's at. And I was like, yeah, so what's it like for you these days? Like that's the first question I ask everybody right now. First question, I'm like, so what's it like for you? Okay. And they're like, yeah, lockdown is this, masks, that, blah, 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 like whatever it is, right? And then already the ice is broken. Mm-hmm. Then what I like to do is I like to triangulate against either like industry or geography and be like, hey, listen, this is what I do. And over the last few weeks, I've just been calling customers and partners in insert sector, healthcare, right, or whatever, and say, or in Seattle, whatever, and then say, you know, and this is what I've been hearing. And so I'm curious, like, are you experiencing some of those same things, right? And how can I help, right? And so for me, that's the kind of path. Now, the important part to remember, and I'm sure everybody's experiencing this, is like, people aren't generally in a chit-chat mood right now, right? Like, for all of us, our hair is on fire. We're trying to keep our businesses afloat. Mm-hmm. But the important part is that I immediately validate myself in very practical terms. Now is not the time to talk about same school, same hometown. Now is the time to be like, I work in your industry. This is what I'm hearing. Are you experiencing the same things? And then they're like, oh, good point. Okay, let's talk about that because I need to solve my problems.
Interesting.
Right? So for me, like, there's the human element of like, it is a brave new world out there. Like it's been 100 years since anybody on the planet has experienced what we're all experiencing, right? Since the Spanish flu. And so it's a great entree. Just don't use the word COVID. Just talk about like, so how's it going for you, right? Like, just ignore that word. But
crazy times.
Yeah. Crazy times. Yeah. And so I think for me, that's the approach. Okay. And then the confidence building piece, the imposter syndrome piece, is always start the day with existing clients, people that you know, or that they know the org. Build your confidence up early, right? 3 to 5 calls, get it out of the way. And one thing I will say is that, because I've worked with more than 1,000 startups, 4-time entrepreneur, sometimes, you know, people get quotas, right? You got to make a minimum 25 cold calls a day. Mm-hmm. You know what? 25 cold calls a day, the average tech company, when pitching for, say, like a round of $1 million, $1.5 million, their pitch is 5 minutes. So when I hear 25 calls a day, I'm like, yeah, that's about right. You know, it is, and you guys know this, it's actually an extraordinary amount of time when it comes to like, hey, my name is, like, you know, and I'm calling from, and it's like, you know, I do a lot of work in your industry and I'm just crazy times, and like, how you doing? Right. And then within 5 minutes, you'll know, do they seem to like me? Do I think they're a fit? If they're not a fit, get them off the phone. Right. Yeah. And so, and one thing I would say to everybody is control the no. You don't want the client to control the no. You control the no. Are they a fit or aren't they? Right. And that's the SAP model. And like, why would you compete with a training program that has created what, the 3rd largest software company in the world? Right.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I absolutely love that strategy, actually calling 3 to 5 of your current customers. And I think any SDR can do that. I remember when I was and this is like when I just started to inbound, right? I actually did call some of our current customers just to kind of get an idea of like what challenges they're facing and, like you said, how you can help. But I think what that does is it creates business acumen, so you understand your company even better. But it also gives you that confidence, because if they're top customers, they're not going to be a jerk to you, you know, flat out on the phone. But it builds that confidence, and that can actually lead to like this likability theory, right? But also from your standpoint, I guess from a psychology aspect, just more confidence in who you are, which comes off across on the phone.
Yeah. And then the trick, the real secret, the first call of the day should be to somebody that you sold to in the last 90 days who will not buy from you right now.
Interesting.
And the reason, of course, is it's a relationship. They know you have nothing to sell them. So there's zero pressure on both sides. And then what you're doing is you're like, hey, John, like, how's it going? You know, and just say like, you know what, I've been having some calls in your sector. And like, I was just thinking back to when you and I last spoke, and I'm like, I just want it, like, how's it going? Crazy times. Anything I can do to help? You already have my product, but is there anything I can do to help? Like, can I connect you to folks? Like, what's going on? Right. And then, because then the first call out of the gate is like, there's no possibility for a no, right? Like, and you don't even have to worry about getting to a yes. To your point, you're building acumen up but you're also hearing the language of how people are describing the current situation, how they're asking for help or not asking for help, right? And then that helps to inform when you get other people on the phone, because sometimes you get somebody on the phone and they're like, yeah, I'm buried.
Yeah.
That actually doesn't tell you anything, right? And so
Did-
then
did-
you're like, it's funny you say that, because I was just talking to Andy and he said this, which sounds like buried. And then that person's like, well, actually, now that you mention it, yeah, buried is this. And then it actually gives you something to work with, right? And yeah, for what it's worth. So
Yeah, no, I love that you said that. And just to add to be an echo chamber on top of like building that confidence at the beginning of the day, like if you have the opportunity to be an all-bound rep, I always call my inbound leads first, because I know that's much warmer. They already know the product.
Yeah.
They already know my solution, so that you can just warm up your confidence, get that acumen, and then continue and do your outbounding.
Yeah, well said.
And kind of a segue into another question I had, hearing all the experiences about like you selling the services, understanding the pain, just asking questions of how you can support each other, really made me draw a lot of connections between your current role as well as the SDR role. And I'd love to hear more connections from you for like our SDR viewers, like me and Marcos, and I'm sure a lot of our audience want to be like entrepreneurs, CEOs in the future. Can you share kind of the transferable skills that maybe like we should focus on, or just kind of identify that will be very helpful for us, for you when you're a CEO, or when we're a CEO, et cetera?
Absolutely. So embracing no, overcoming obstacles, and sales objections. The term that we use in the tech world is called finding product market fit. And so, who is that ideal customer for my product or service, and how do I go find them, and how do I help them to find me? I think another transferable skill is the building acumen that you guys, using the term that the two of you were sharing, because there's a sage business leader that I know in Lagos, Nigeria. And I still remember he said it. I'd never, ever heard anybody say it before. And he just said it so succinctly. He's like, if you understand the industry, you are already halfway to winning. And that is so true. And so I think just, so anytime you have an opportunity to build acumen within your industry, for sure. And then from SDR to entrepreneur, yeah, for sure. Setting goals and metrics and milestones. And in particular, setting goals and metrics and milestones with the lens that they're set up to help you learn, right? Like a quota system, for example, is not a performance system. It is not a punishment system. A quota system is a learning system, right? How big is the market in a sector? How big is the market in a geography? What can the average deal size actually be, right? How much revenue can we generate inbound versus outbound? How much can we do, e-com versus, and so metrics and milestones are our best friends, but they're our best friends when we approach them as learning, right? Marcos, you and I were talking earlier about like hitting quota at the end of a month and a quarter, and obviously in your case, like end of a month, end of a quarter coming up. And so it's an interesting point, because for me, if I was your boss at the end of the month and you exceed your quota, I would spend 6 seconds on congratulating you. And then I would say to you, so month of July, right after COVID, in the midst of a recession, you just exceeded quota. How did that happen? Why did it happen? What is it teaching us? What are the patterns within that information? That's where quotas and metrics and milestones come in, is like, how can we unlock the learning to make us more successful as business people, right? And that's the important piece. And then the last thing that I would say is transferable is, and obviously Andy and Marcos, talking to the two of you guys are not the only salesperson on your teams, right? It takes a village to make a company grow. It takes a village to start a business. You can't do it alone, right? So you're part of a team now. You want to go run a business, you better have a team, right? They can be employees, they can be co-founders, they can be contractors, doesn't matter, but you can't do it alone, right? And so knowing how to build and then work with a team, I think is critical. So that's my response.
Yeah. You hit the nail on the head with a lot of that. The one that caught my attention was like the ICP, and that's very transferable to the SDR role as well. If you're going after the wrong personas, there's absolutely no way you're going to hit your quota. So that's one thing that I always teach, at least my mentees as well. And those that are just starting off, like go onto the website, right? Figure out who your ICPs are and just like put in a LinkedIn sales nav search and like hit everybody up. Because chances are, if they're in the same industry, same vertical, they're probably going to have the same challenges. Yep. So, Andy, did you have any other questions before we kind of wrap it up and go to rapid fire?
Yeah, I just wanted to add a comment. It's like for the struggling SDRs, maybe even for me, I'm speaking to myself here. It's I've had moments of where you can get lost in the motion, where I'm just doing the same thing every single day, and you kind of forget the vision of like, why are we doing this? Why am I working so hard? If I can give like one advice from the experience that you just shared, those transferable skills, like every time you're going into a meeting, every time you're trying to get that meeting or doing those little things, like think about the goal, think about the vision. Like for me, it's like, I want to be an entrepreneur and CEO one day, and I'm building those skills to get there. So like, thank you for sharing like those transferable skills so that I can have in the back of my mind of, why am I doing this? Why am I busting my tail during this economic recession?
Yeah. Yeah. And one thing that I would highlight, and we all have our tips and tricks and techniques, right? Yeah. And so one thing I have at the top of every page, like when I start a call, I put the name of the org at the top of the page, and I put the date, and then right under the org's name, I just write like, how can I help them today? Right. So in particular, I say, how can I help today? And that's the question. That's the only question I'm trying to answer. Right. And so for me, and just to be clear, again, human nature, we all love to help other people. And so for me, that's just like, that's my fuel. Right. Yeah. And then to your point, Andy, what you said is what you write on the bathroom mirror, right? Which is like, I'm going to be my own boss one day, or I'm going to change the world in this way. Right. So that's the thing that you see at the end of the day, and then the first thing in the morning when you wake up. And then the technique that I like to use, I just like to remind myself, like, I want to help this person today. I'm not trying to sell. Sell will come automatically. And I'll give you the stat, which I like to share right now, which is, I was talking about that 4-week blitz that I had at the start of the recession. So between then and now, I am on a 100% close rate.
Wow.
And here's my comment. My comment is, I have not called 300 people.
Okay.
Right? Like I call 40, right? And so the point is like, to your point, Marcos, ICP, right? So the goal is like, I wasn't calling everybody. I was calling one type of like my ideal customer. I just called them, and I ignored everybody else. And then the benefit is then you start knocking them down, and then they start sharing, and then you start to get the inbound. And so that was really critical. So it's funny because it's a cool stat, but it's a vanity metric on the close rate.
Yeah.
What's the truth is, I just refuse to call anybody who was outside of my ICP. So
well, that's so interesting too, because I know a lot of SDRs are struggling out there as well. Because when you're given, and this is kind of a side note, like when you're given a SDR role and you're given your territory, you have, if you're inbound, you can have over 12,000 accounts, or there's a lot of accounts, or even in enterprise you have 100, 200 accounts. But I think what you hit on, Keith, was this idea of, where's the money going, right? Where's the industry going? Like, do I want to reach out to somebody in travel right now, right? Or someone in biopharma and healthcare, right? It's like, you kind of have to know where the market's going, and just like, massive thanks for kind of sharing that tidbit to the audience there.
Well, and maybe as a tip for everyone, so you made a quick comment right there where you're like, I have, say, 12,000 accounts.
Yep.
So then what you said was the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to run a filter against industry. And if they're in tourism, they're out, hypothetically, right? So for me, we have industry, geography,
Okay.
role. The other one I like to look at, of course, is size of org.
Yep. What about growth rate?
Now what I start to do is at the end of a week, at the end of a month, then I'm like, look, the only people who are buying right now are VP or higher, and they're in orgs of this size in these 3 sectors. And then everybody else gets chucked out, right? But I would be like laser focused. So not just industry, I would go size of org, geography, role. Who's actually buying right now, right? And the reason is because those are the people that need the most help. Good, go help them, right?
Yeah, that's right. They do need the most help. And I actually had a shift in mindset too, because when I started as an AE at Okta, it was right during COVID. And I had all these accounts. I was like, oh my gosh, how am I going to prioritize? I think about a month and a half in, I started to figure out that all the money was going into like healthcare, biopharma. But then I started to do more research. And it's not only that, it's companies that are growing at 30, 40% 1-year growth. They have new leaders, and it's primarily the VP of IT that is buying. And so like reaching out to that VP of IT, and then also talking to my customers and asking, hey, what are like the three biggest challenges you're facing right now? And like I guess I haven't thought of it like, how can I help? Maybe it's just innate, but I started to write those down, and I'd go to these other VPs of IT and give them that value, right? And then all of a sudden they're interested, right?
So hear what you just said. What you just said was helping people and finding the patterns innate. That's like first brain stuff, right? So now the benefit is for everybody listening. What we're actually saying is all of us are probably unconsciously doing this, subconsciously doing this. But the important part is to then put it on a sheet of paper, or, put it somewhere, database, spreadsheet, whatever, where you're like, this is the pattern. So to your point, orgs of a certain size, the head of IT with this kind of growth pattern in these sectors. That is the level of specificity that allows all of us to win, right? And so I agree. And then ironically, by the way, 60 days ago, you would have said tourism, no way. Now you do because of domestic tourism, because now people are like, they're like done. I just got off the phone this morning with a guy who just went on a road trip from Texas to Virginia, because he's like, I just got to get out of the house.
Just got to get out.
But no, you can't go outside of country. So everybody's like, I wonder what's going on in Virginia these days, or wherever. So the hottest, like one of the hottest markets right now, if you look at month over month revenue, is actually the tourism sector, because now everybody's traveling domestically.
Like RVs too. Like I know the RV market right now is like going up crazy. But that's right. So like not necessarily throwing like specific travel industry out of the way, but finding that segment or that market that's actually growing, going there, asking them what are some of those challenges, how can you help, right? And solving the problem.
Spot on.
Whew. Wow. Insights, man. This is great. Well, thanks, Keith, for that. But now is really kind of our segment where we do rapid fire questions. And I'll start with the first one, which is, do you love to win or do you hate to lose?
Love to win, because if I win, other people win.
Ooh.
So, yeah.
Oh, that's the best answer I think we've gotten so far. It's yourself.
It's the most succinct and one that made me think a little bit too. So appreciate that.
Awesome.
Second question. What is a failure or an apparent failure that has set you up for later success? Do you have a favorite failure of yours?
Yeah, for sure. I had an opportunity to sell a business once, and we didn't. And honestly, what that particular situation taught me was what I call the lie across the railroad tracks moment. There are moments in our careers where we look at a situation and we say, I know what the right thing is to do. I will do everything in my power to convince the other people to do it. But if they don't agree, I'm going to step out. That is a lie across the railroad tracks moment. And when I say step out, I mean step out of the company, step out. And those, like in my career, that's happened 3 times. And the first time I didn't do it, and it will burn in my memory forever. So there are just those moments, and you have to be true to yourself, and you have to be true to what you believe in. And so for me, that, and by the way, sometimes the first one is hard to see until after the fact, but after that, you'll always know when they come. So, yeah.
It's kind of that like learning from experience, which we talked about, which is like the difference between like tactical and teachings and this like wisdom, right?
Yep.
That's great. And so kind of the last question we always like to ask is where can, our audience go and follow you? Is that on LinkedIn? Is that a website?
It's a good question. Best place to follow me for sure is LinkedIn. And just for your audience, there are only 2 Keith Ippels in the world. The second one is my dad. And so, because I'm a junior, and so my comment to you is if you accidentally connect with my dad, he's a lovely man. You'll love to connect with him. He's 80 years old, and so yeah. But if you want to connect up with me, I'm the Vancouver Keith. My dad is the Toronto Keith. So just so you know.
Good to know.
There we go. Well, I mean, amazing podcast / episode today. I just have notes galore. I mean, you could see here just all on this, flashcard, and hopefully the audience does as well. I just want to thank you for coming, and Andy, feel free to like chime in last thoughts.
Just once again, Keith, like we touched on so many topics from the psychology of sales to the imposter syndrome to just like the transferable skills between an SDR and an entrepreneur. And it's lit up, I think, a second fire of me of like the reason why we're doing this during economic recession is to really help other people and like do that, be that why. So just want to give you a major shout out and a thanks for coming on to our show.
Yeah, really appreciate it, guys. Like, fantastic chat. Love it. Love what you guys are doing to support other SDRs, not only in their current role, but in their career path. And so keep up the great work. Really excited for what you're doing.
Thank you for listening to the SDR Live podcast. If you like this episode, please share, comment, and subscribe. Make sure you tune in next week and have a fantastic week.